I never believed in the supernatural, not really. Sure, ghost stories were fun around the campfire, and horror movies gave me the occasional jolt, but that's where my interest ended. Reality was solid, explainable, and grounded, or so I thought. What happened to me changed all that, and even now, years later, I'm still haunted by it. It started on a Saturday, an overcast day where the clouds hung low and thick, as if the sky itself was warning me. My Aunt Emily had passed away the week before, and our family was tasked with sorting through her old belongings. Aunt Emily's house was an old Victorian relic on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a postcard for most haunted places in America. It creaked, it groaned, and its walls seemed to whisper in protest against the passage of time. "Why don't you take some of her things back to your place?" my mom suggested as we sorted through dusty boxes in the attic. "You've just moved into that new apartment, and you could use some decorations." I reluctantly agreed, grabbing a few knickknacks and an old clock. But one item caught my attention as I packed up: a porcelain doll sitting in a rocking chair by the window. Its glassy blue eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and its painted lips curled into a faint frozen smile that somehow felt off. "She loved that thing," Mom said, catching my gaze. "Your aunt always said it was special. Said it kept her company after Uncle Greg passed." "Special," I repeated, frowning. I wasn't sure what made it special besides the fact that it looked unnervingly lifelike. Still, I didn't want to argue, so I added the doll to my pile and took it home. At first, nothing happened. The doll sat on a shelf in my living room, propped against the wall, its unsettling eyes staring straight ahead. I had shoved it there almost as an afterthought, planning to pack it away in a closet once I found a box big enough. But as days turned into a week, I began to notice small, odd occurrences. It started with little things. The doll's head seemed to shift position slightly when I wasn't looking. One night, I was certain its hand had moved, resting against its lap instead of hanging by its side. I blamed it on my imagination. Maybe I had accidentally nudged it while cleaning, or maybe the thing wasn't as stable as I thought. Then, one evening, I came home late from work to find the doll sitting on the floor. It had been on the shelf when I left. My pulse quickened as I bent down to pick it up. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the room itself was holding its breath. "Great," I muttered to myself, setting the doll back on the shelf. "Now you're jumping off shelves like some bad movie prop." But deep down, I wasn't so sure it was an accident. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up in bed trying to place the noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room. My heart began to race as I crept toward the door, the sound growing louder with each step. When I finally peeked into the living room, my breath caught. The rocking chair, the same one I'd brought back from Aunt Emily's house, was moving, gently swaying back and forth. And the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting in the chair, its painted face illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight outside. I froze, unsure whether to scream or run. Instead, I did something entirely irrational. I stepped closer. "What is this?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. The room was silent except for the creak of the chair. Gathering my nerve, I grabbed the doll and set it back on the shelf, then shoved the rocking chair against the wall to stop it from moving. My hands were trembling as I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I decided to do some research. Maybe the doll was worth something, maybe it was just an old antique with a bizarre history. I snapped a photo and posted it to an online forum dedicated to collectibles. Within minutes, I received a reply. "Where did you get this doll?" The question sent a shiver down my spine. I explained the situation briefly, and the person responded almost immediately. "That's a spirit vessel. You need to get rid of it, but not carelessly. There are steps you need to take." A spirit vessel? The term sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad ghost hunting show. But as I read more of the comments pouring in, a chilling picture began to form. According to the users on the forum, dolls like this one were often used to house restless spirits or energies, either intentionally or accidentally. If not handled properly, they could become active. I decided I'd had enough. That evening, I grabbed the doll and shoved it into a box, taping it shut for good measure. I planned to take it to a donation center the next day. But when I woke up the following morning, the box was empty. The doll was back on the shelf, its frozen smile wider than I remembered. From that point on, things escalated. Lights flickered, doors slammed. I'd hear faint giggling at odd hours, always coming from the direction of the doll. Once I woke up to find it sitting on my nightstand, its glassy eyes staring directly into mine. I tried everything. I burned sage, said prayers, even consulted a local psychic. Nothing worked. The psychic, a kind but frazzled woman named Margie, told me something that made my blood run cold. "The spirit isn't just restless," she said, her voice trembling. "It's angry, and it's attached to you now." I'll never forget the night it all came to a head. I had decided to take drastic measures, planning to drive the doll far out of town and bury it. But as I prepared to leave, the power went out, plunging my apartment into darkness. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps, pattering softly across the hardwood floor. My heart pounded as I fumbled for a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was standing in the doorway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. That was when the whispering started. After that horrifying night, I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment with the doll. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed louder, more insistent. Every time I tried to sleep, I'd hear faint giggles, muffled words that I couldn't quite make out. The air in my home was thick, oppressive, as though the doll's presence itself was draining the life out of the place and me. That morning, I called Margie, the psychic, desperate for advice. Her voice was tense when she answered. "You didn't get rid of it properly, did you?" she asked. "I tried," I blurted out, "but it came back. It's still here, and I think it's getting worse." Margie sighed deeply, as though she'd heard this before. "You need to act fast. Whatever's tied to that doll is feeding off your fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes." Her words sent a chill through me. How could I not be afraid? I didn't say that out loud, though. Instead, I asked, "What do I do?" "You have to bind it," she said. "Contain it. There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. If you're not careful, you could make things worse." I didn't see how things could get any worse, so I agreed. Margie gave me a list of items to gather. Salt, black candles, a mirror, and a red ribbon. She also warned me to stay calm and focused during the ritual. "If you falter, even for a second," she said, "the spirit could lash out." That night, I set up everything in my living room. The doll sat in the center of a salt circle, its glassy eyes gleaming in the candlelight. The mirror was propped up behind it, reflecting its eerie smile. My hands shook as I lit the candles and began to chant the words Margie had written down for me. At first, nothing happened. Then the temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath came out in white puffs, and the flames of the candles flickered violently. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I kept chanting, my voice trembling but determined. The doll's head suddenly snapped to the side, as though it were looking at something over its shoulder. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay focused. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for me. Then it happened. The doll moved. Not just a subtle shift this time. It stood up, wobbling on its porcelain legs, and took a step toward me. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but I stayed rooted in place. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, barely audible over the cacophony of growls and whispers. The doll took another step, and then another. It was inside the salt circle, but the barrier seemed to do nothing to stop it. Desperate, I grabbed the red ribbon and threw it over the doll, binding its arms and legs. As I tightened the knot, the growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the mirror behind the doll shattered, and I was thrown backward by an unseen force. The last thing I remembered was the sound of shattering glass and a high-pitched, inhuman scream. I woke up hours later, sprawled on the floor. The candles had burned out and the room was eerily quiet. The doll was lying in the center of the salt circle, motionless. The red ribbon was still tied around it, but something about it seemed different. Its eyes, once gleaming and lifelike, were dull and empty. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the doll, still bound with the ribbon, and stuffed it into a metal box. Then I drove out to the woods, far from town, and buried it deep in the ground. As I covered the box with dirt, I said a final prayer, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever was inside from ever escaping. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent my heart racing. But as time passed, the unease slowly faded. I moved to a new apartment, far from the one where it all began, and tried to rebuild my life. Still, I couldn't forget what had happened. Even now, I sometimes dream of the doll, its frozen smile, its glassy eyes following me wherever I went. And in those dreams, I hear the whispering again, soft and distant, as though it's calling me back. For days after burying the doll in the woods, I felt a fragile sense of relief. The oppressive air in my home had lifted, and the whispers that had haunted me for weeks were finally gone. Yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. It's not that I wanted to believe in curses or spirits, but after what I had experienced, ignoring the truth was no longer an option. Margie had warned me, spirits like this don't let go easily. But I hoped she was wrong. For my own sanity, I needed her to be wrong. A week later, I started noticing subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. It began with my dreams, or rather, nightmares. In them, I would be back in my apartment, standing in the living room with the doll staring at me. But in the dreams, it wasn't lifeless anymore. Its mouth would move, though I couldn't hear what it was saying. Its eyes blinked slowly, unnervingly, as it tilted its head toward me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, the image of its frozen smile burned into my mind. Then the noises started. Late at night, I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. At first, I told myself it was just mice or the old pipes in my new apartment settling. But the sounds weren't random. They came in patterns, soft, deliberate, like someone running their nails across the plaster. And they always seemed to come from the direction of my bedroom closet. One night, the scratching turned into tapping. I'll never forget the moment I opened the closet door, flashlight in hand, ready to prove to myself that it was nothing. The tapping stopped as soon as I turned the knob. My heart was racing as I swept the light across the empty space. There was nothing unusual, just my clothes and a few boxes piled in the corner. But as I turned to close the door, I felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. My breath hitched and I froze, unable to move. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from right behind me. "Did you miss me?" I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was no one there. The closet was empty. Yet in the back of my mind, I knew the voice wasn't a figment of my imagination. I knew who, or what, it belonged to. The next morning, I called Margie again. She answered on the first ring, her voice tense. "It's back, isn't it?" she asked, as though she had been expecting this. "I buried it," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I did everything you said. How is this still happening?" Margie sighed, the kind of heavy sigh that comes with bad news. "You bound the spirit to the doll, but you didn't release it. Burying it only trapped it temporarily. It's still connected to you." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. "What do I do now?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "You have to sever the connection once and for all," Margie said, "and to do that, you'll need to confront it directly." That night, I prepared for the final confrontation. Margie had given me instructions for a ritual that would release the spirit and break its hold on me. It involved salt, candles, and a mirror, just like before, but this time there was an added element: fire. "You'll need to burn the doll," Margie had said, "but be careful, it won't go quietly." The thought of digging up the doll and bringing it back into my home sent shivers down my spine. But I knew there was no other choice. Just before midnight, I drove out to the woods with a flashlight and a shovel, my hands trembling as I unearthed the metal box. The moment I opened it, a wave of icy air rushed over me, and I heard a faint giggle, so soft it was almost lost in the wind. I didn't waste any time. I brought the doll back to my apartment and set up the ritual. The candles flickered as I placed the doll in the center of the salt circle, its lifeless eyes staring up at me. I could feel the energy in the room shift, growing heavier with each passing second. As I began the chant, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. The doll's head turned slightly, its painted lips parting as though it were about to speak. My voice faltered, but I forced myself to keep going, reciting the words Margie had given me. Suddenly, the mirror behind the doll cracked, and a deafening screech filled the air. The doll's limbs jerked unnaturally, as though it were struggling against invisible chains. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching high into the air. I grabbed the lighter and held it to the edge of the doll's dress. The fabric caught fire quickly, the flames spreading upward and consuming the porcelain. The screeching grew louder, almost unbearable, and the room seemed to shake. But as the flames reached the doll's face, the noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. The air grew still, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. It's been months since that night. The doll is gone, reduced to ash, and the strange occurrences have stopped. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see it standing there, its frozen smile waiting for me. I've tried to move on, but some nights I still hear the faintest whisper in the darkness. Did you miss me? Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.